for agreeing to present here today. And I'll just pass it on along to you.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Let me just share my screen here. Lovely. So to give you some context, I'm one of the assistant directors in the first-year composition program. I've been at NIU since 1997. I am generally in charge of things to do with technology in the program. I have some kind of background and experience in web design and in database management and other forms of kind of the intersection between writing and technology. So it's not a big surprise that I've been kind of leaning into various aspects of AI and kind of teasing out the places where it's useful and the line where it becomes not useful. And I hope to share with you today some of the observations that I've made over the last 18 to 24 months, and more specifically, share with you the results of a project that my students are doing this semester, which are really kind of looking at that, the line of AI use specifically in writing classes. Okay, so let me kind of go over the broad strokes of the presentation this afternoon. Are going to include first kind of talking through the parameters of the study that my students and I did this semester, talking through the main results of those studies, which will kind of inform the next three groupings, which is specificity of prompts, specificity of instructions to students, and perceived competence. And then finally, we have a slide kind of with some takeaways and some concluding remarks. I'll note that I already sent a copy of this presentation to Amanda. Most of my work is produced with a Creative Commons license, so I'm really happy to share work with anyone who's interested in it. So the question that we were asking in my class this semester is very apropos for the presentation we're doing today. Put very simply, it's what are the conditions of optimal use of AI by students in a writing class at NIU? And we'll kind of drill down and get a little bit more specific, but that's kind of the broad question that we were looking at during the entire semester. For people who don't know, English 203 is our research course. We tend to want to focus on local topics that affect students here at NIU in an immediate sort of way for a variety of reasons. It happened to work out this semester really well with kind of the focus that I wanted to use for this class on application of artificial intelligence tools and kind of the ways in which we could distinguish conditions where students tended to abuse the tools versus conditions where students tended to use the tools productively, and try to tease out some of those variables and identify them so that we can be better prepared as faculty to help support our students. As you can see, the students were roughly split into groups of 4 or 5. Each group either used ChatGPT or I worked with Grammarly. They gave us a handful of licenses, 15 to be precise, to examine the Grammarly for Education product, to test that versus the free version versus some of the other products on the market, to see what, if any, difference that made within the equations. Spoiler alert, it didn't make much difference at all in terms of the results that we saw, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the other things that I did was have the students further isolate their examination because use of AI, as you all probably know, covers a vast array of different kinds of situations and technologies. And I wanted to make sure that the students were drilling down to a specific enough focus that they could do a halfway decent job on the project. So I had one group who looked at using ChatGPT specifically for math problems, especially for trigonometry problems is where they ended up really focusing. We had another group focusing on using Grammarly for Education for business and professional writing, specifically with regards to resumes. I had another group use Grammarly and examine where and how the students applied the drafting tool of that particular set of technologies. And then I had a couple more groups use ChatGPT in a kind of a broader sort of way for drafting, revising, brainstorming, and outlining. In terms of research, the students use surveys of the student population at NIU to determine general self-reported usage patterns. Students also conducted focus groups that performed specific writing tasks. So essentially, it was a usability study. So we got groups of 3 or 4 people in. We sat them down in front of a laptop. The participants were given kind of specific writing prompts, and then the group observed how they interacted with the technologies and how they interacted with different tools, depending on a set of different variables that I'll talk about in just a minute. Before we go any further, one thing that I think that is important to kind of discriminate here is that both the terms AI and use are really, really vague. So I kind of want to unpack both of those. Here, when we say AI, we really mean ChatGPT 3.5, that particular tool for generative AI, or Grammarly for Education, which happens to use a very similar back end for their generative AI portion of the Grammarly product, right? Use is a lot trickier. When we say using AI, it can actually refer to a wide array of different kinds of applications, and especially within the writing process, use can be applied in a lot of different sorts of ways. So if we kind of think about the writing process, we can kind of break it down into a whole bunch of steps. This is, I will say, a very, very simplified version of the writing process. It doesn't talk about recursion. Arguably, there's other steps that might be involved, but for our purposes today, the simplified version should suffice, right? So the point that I want to make here is that often when we talk about our students using AI, we mean one particular step, and that is step number 5. That is the drafting step. We don't often mean, are they using it for brainstorming? Are they using it for modeling or topic refinement? Typically, when faculty are talking about, or people in general, to be honest, are talking about using AI, often they mean very specifically that drafting step, right? So as I note below, that is where students will generally get into trouble because that is the place where they are using a technology to replace their own voice or replace their own text rather than supplement, rather than polish, rather than refine, rather than inform, right? Unfortunately, it's also the presumed referent of the verb use when we say AI use, right? So one of the things, if nothing else, that I hope to do today is to clarify that when we as faculty say, how are we using technology? I hope we don't just restrict it to that number 5 step, right? I hope that we kind of understand writing is a complex process that has many different phases or aspects to it. And we can apply sets of tools to a variety of locations within that process to greater or lesser effect or impact, but kind of being aware of that entire process, I think, is very helpful, especially when we're thinking about the application of specific tools. So, broad set of results. Most students at NIU have used generative AI for at least one class. And by most students, I mean, according to the survey data that my students are producing, it's north of 85%. So it is by far the norm and not the exception. More interestingly, of the students who filled out the surveys, over 75% of the students who do use generative AI do not use it for only that drafting step. They use it for a variety of different purposes, including modeling, including revision, including proofreading, including checking their knowledge base on kind of understanding concepts, right? So I think it's important for us to kind of appreciate that, number one, our students are using these tools whether we want them to or not. They are using them. And number two, they're actually using them for a variety of different kinds of things. And then number three, importantly, most students have never received instruction in using generative AI in the classroom. And by most, I mean all. There is no results for any of the surveys that my students got back in which the students said that they had been trained to use AI in specific ways. Now, I will say at the outset, this is Baby's first research project. This is a research project that is intended to be kind of a very training wheels version of primary research. So our sample size was very low on the most part. The demographic design of their, kind of the distribution in terms of demographics was most often either arbitrary or kind of a snowball effect or a convenience sample. So we have to take the results from the surveys with a big old grain of salt. Nevertheless, I think they are indicative of some general trends and they are worth us paying some attention to, right? On top of those confirmations, and those are mostly generated from the student surveys, the usability testing that my students did helped identify three main variables that impacted the use of AI by students. Two of these were things that I told my students to test for, and that's numbers 1 and 2. So number 1 is the specificity of the prompt to the user, and my hypothesis was that the more specific the prompt to the student, the less they would rely on AI in the drafting phase. Second variable that we were testing was the specificity of instructions regarding where and how to use AI tools. And again, my hypothesis was that the more specific the instructions on precisely where and how to use these tools, the fewer students or the less chance the students would use these tools in ways that exceeded those parameters. The third variable, honestly, was a surprise. This is not something that we were looking for, but it's something that every single one of my groups ended up reporting to be a major factor in their observations, which was the perceived aptitude of the user. Put simply, if students felt confident that they had a skill set to respond to a prompt, they were much, much, much less likely to use the tools in ways that would be problematic. Conversely, the students who felt very underprepared or very nervous or that they didn't know the answer were much more likely to use the tools in that drafting phase to replace their own work, which they regarded to be bad or underprepared. So in terms of the first variability, or the first variable rather, the specificity of the prompt to user, the way that we designed the test was in the usability tests, the users were given 3 different writing prompts. One of them was really general, one of them was somewhat specific, and one of them was very specific to the user. And my students found that the participants in the study were either very that variable was either very important or extremely important in 60% of the observed subjects. And I gave my students a separate survey to indicate how they use AI in their own work. And they had very similar results in this particular variable. The second variable was specificity of instructions. And again, here we tested it in a kind of lots, some, none sort of gradation. And perhaps predictably, we found that in about 60% of the observed behavior, specificity of instructions was either very or extremely important in how their participants actually used the tools. Interestingly, more of my students reported that it was important in their own work. Although I note here in a footnote, I have been training my students in AI use all semester, so that very well might be a role in their own understanding of the role of instructions within this kind of environment, right? So again, the less specific the instructions to the student, the greater the chance the students would use AI in the drafting phase. And one of the reasons that I say this is in a lot of the syllabi and a lot of the interactions that I see, even in my own program, the instructions amount to a policy statement that sits on the syllabus that says you can or may not use AI in the following ways. And I just kind of want to call attention to the fact that a policy statement is not instruction or modeling, right? I devote class time to modeling these tools, to applying the tools, and have my students actually use them in constructive, specific sorts of ways. And in my experience, it makes a big difference. This shows that the students also found that, both for themselves and for the subjects that they were observing, for the participants. The surprise variable was perceived aptitude, although I guess I will say, in retrospect, this should not have been a surprise variable. In retrospect, the idea that someone who has a perception of very, very low skills is much more likely to turn to outside factors to help supplement that. To be honest, this is where we often see plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is almost never a factor of a student going, wah ha 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 ha, I am going to fool my teacher. It is almost always a factor of last-minute panic, of feeling underprepared, or that they're not capable of performing up to expectations, whether that's a paper, whether that's a test, whether that's a quiz, whether that's a presentation. And they turn to these other tools, right? So for our program, the inclusion of AI is like yet one more way in which students express those feelings of panic and express those feelings of self-doubt by replacing the work that they feel, their own work, which they feel is inadequate, with something to replace it, right? So here we can see the importance for the observed subjects. We have about 40% rating is either very important or extremely important. Notice on the self-report, it's even higher than that. It's 60% are reporting that the students' own feelings of confidence in their work is either very important or extremely important. And again, in retrospect, this should have been obvious to me, but I think it's a really important finding that kind of reinforces the contexts in which students are able to either employ the tools productively or lean on them as crutches, right, to help supplement a real or perceived inadequacy by the part of the student. So what I want to do in the next few slides is kind of go back through each one of these areas and kind of talk about kind of how does this impact our pedagogy, or what are some ways that these findings can kind of influence what we're doing in our classroom. So the specificity of prompt, again, the findings were that the more specific the prompt was to the student's own personal life and situation, the less likely they were to abuse tools. So you can see what I've done is tried to suggest three, really simple examples where you take a kind of broad generic prompt and turn it into something a little bit more specific, right? Describe 3 impacts of McCarthyism. You can easily turn that into describe 3 specific ways in which you see the repercussions of McCarthyism impacting your life, right? So we're still asking for the same knowledge set, but we're asking for it in a way in which the student is able to kind of connect their personal lives to the subject matter in question. I will mention this is also just good pedagogy. So it does help protect against AI. It also helps engage students, right? There's a pretty vigorous field of research about pedagogy that suggests that the more that you can have your students relate lessons to their own lives and interpret it in that context, the more they're going to get out of it, and the more they're going to learn, and the more they're going to be engaged, right? So this is yet one more example where having prompts that tie lessons specifically to students' own experiences is a valuable and worthwhile thing to do. Specificity of instruction, I'm going to take a little bit more time here because I think this is one place where faculty may have less experience. And so I wanted to kind of give some examples of specific kinds of interventions that may be helpful for teachers and for students. Again, the kind of reminder is that the more specific the instructions, the better. Most students have had none instruction on how to do any of these things, and that policies are not in and of themselves sufficient. They are not in and of themselves modeling or kind of sufficient levels of instruction. So you're going to kind of follow me through a writing process that I use with my students. I gave a presentation to the student athletes about 6 weeks ago about using AI, and we kind of walked through an example of different ways to use AI in different aspects of the writing project, right? So brainstorming here, you can see I threw into chat, hey, chat, give me some research topics related to the European metalcore scene. Happens to be an interest of mine, but you can imagine this being a topic related to whatever class happens to be in question. It spit out a whole bunch of things. I chose one in green that we can drill down into later, but it gives you a pretty good example of the kind of utility that AI can give students for kind of broad topic selection and kind of thinking about, well, what interests you and how does the stuff that interests you intersect the stuff we're talking about in class? In terms of topic refinement, notice how I'm taking that green line from the previous slide and then drilling down and asking the AI, hey, can you tell me more? Can you give me some examples of this particular kind of topic? And the AI is like, sure, right? So this may be a helpful moment to kind of remind ourselves, AI is essentially a really smart, fancy parrot. It doesn't think, it doesn't have an agenda, it doesn't have agency. Its whole thing is to sound human, right? It is trying to sound like humans sound. And another way of saying that is when people talk about these kinds of topics, what kinds of things do they say? What does that sound like, right? So in terms of like brainstorming and topic generation, effectively what you're doing is saying, so give me some examples of things that people talk about, and then when we're drilling down more specifically, show me some specific kind of ways in which we narrow down those fields, right? When we get into the modeling and planning, one of the things that we recognize within the first year composition program is that a lot of students are not familiar with a lot of the genres that we are asking them to work in. A IMRAD style psychology paper is very different from a chemistry lab report, is very different from an anthropology paper, is very different from a, you know, kind of a literature analysis, right? So obviously, as teachers, it's important for us to give our students models of the thing that we are asking them to do, right? In broad strokes, what does the structure look like? What is the tone? What is the register? What are the important generic features and conventions that are important expectations for our audience within this field, right? So one of the things that AI is really good at is pointing to those kinds of models, right? Or reproducing those kinds of models, right? Again, because AI, broadly speaking, or at least generative AI, broadly speaking, is really good at modeling, right? Because it shows you, here's what people tend to do when they are doing this kind of thing. That's what AI is good for, right? And so for the purposes of modeling, right, and you can see here, can you point me to a couple of studies looking at female-fronted metalcore bands related to gender? It does so. Both of these actually exist there. I did double check it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But these are both really good models for the kind of thing that I would want my students to be producing. Again, outlining, AI is going to be really good at outlining because it's a fairly standard kind of activity, right? It has many, 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 many examples. And by kind of synthesizing those examples, it can give you a realistic version of what someone might do if they were trying to do this sort of thing, right? So you can see here, I've truncated this so that it would fit onto a slide. It was actually much, much longer than it is right now. But introduction, and then kind of going through some definitions and gender dynamics, going through some case studies, and then kind of going to a conclusion. Yeah, that's exactly what we would want this structure to look like, at least in broad strokes, right? And again, for students who lack familiarity, having these sorts of models is super important in the same ways that if we were in cooking school and you ask someone to make a roux, if they've never heard of a roux before, they're going to have a real problem being able to perform that, right? But if you give them, like, here's the basic idea of the thing that you're trying to do, they're going to be much more able to do that sort of task. Drafting, as I said, is the least useful of application tools. One of the things that I want to suggest to you is I encourage my students to use AI in different parts of the writing process, and I have a place for them to talk about and show me what those interactions look like. So I have them record their prompts. I have them record the AI-generated material that comes out of their prompts. I have them demonstrate the ways in which they do or do not incorporate specific suggestions from the AI. So from my perspective, the use of AI is not the problem. The lack of transparency is the problem, right? The fact that it's often hard to tell what is the student's work, what is the machine's work. And so giving them a venue, giving them a vehicle that they can use to portray that transparency, in my perspective, is really, really important, and makes the tools much less taboo and much more useful. But I will also mention, because I don't really mention it anywhere else, but I do think it's important. Prompt design is a skill set, right? Using generative AI requires certain kinds of skills to make the AI produce a certain kind of output that you are trying to produce. And I think it is worth teaching those skills. I'm not sure where or how to teach that, but I do think it's a worthwhile skill. And especially the more AI gets integrated in a variety of ways, giving students the agency and the skill sets to be empowered to work with that set of tools in ways that are productive is going to be increasingly important. Revision is a little tricky if you don't presume that there is only one form of good writing. I will say in the first year comp program, we recognize there's no such thing as good writing. There are many, many, many good writings. Writing is discipline and audience specific, and what is good to one audience will not necessarily be good to another. So in order to think about the application of these tools to revision, we have to have a little bit more kind of a nuanced understanding of what is the purpose of the communication? Who is their audience? What kind of register, what kind of dialect is your audience going to be expecting? What is the most useful approach given your task, given your audience to the current situation, right? Nevertheless, the revision tools for AI are kind of useful. And one of the reasons that I want to qualify that is because AI is really pretty good at cleaning up and producing what we would recognize as some version of academic dialect. It is really bad at producing writing for other dialects in kind of broad scale, because it's not trained to do that. Like, and again, I'm talking mostly about like your ChatGPT. I'm talking about your Grammarly, right? AI can be trained to do almost anything you want it to do, but most students are not using it in those sorts of, super sophisticated, nuanced sort of ways. They're using it in pretty simple, straightforward sorts of ways. So here's just an example of a paper that I wrote a few years ago comparing linguistics to genetics and looking at the relationship between those two fields. The language on the left is a little dense, and I will admit my writing in general tends to be a little dense. So I asked AI to simplify it, and I think it did a pretty good job. I'm not going to spend too long on this point because I think it's mostly pretty apparent. And then finally, proofreading. The big problem here, actually, I'm going to kind of mention two big problems here. One of them is that, like any tool, if you rely on it too much, it becomes a crutch, right? So if the only way that you're able to revise your own writing to meet specific requirements related to dialect, related to conventions, relating to other forms of the written product, eventually you become reliant on those tools, right? The other thing to mention there is that the application of AI to the proofreading step can cause some faculty members to conflate the proofreading step with the drafting step, right? So in other words, even if a student starts off with their own work and uses AI only for proofreading, it will sound often like it is being generated by AI, right? Partially because a lot of faculty take the lack of mechanical mistakes to be evidence of AI, especially evidence of AI in the drafting process. So I think we need to be exceedingly careful about teasing out content that has been using AI tools for the purpose of proofreading versus application of AI tools that have been used in the drafting step. And those are very, very different sort of things. And again, in my experience, the best way to tell the difference between those two is to have a log where the students show you how they use these tools and where they applied them, right? In other words, either like a reflection or a process discussion, a separate document accompanying the product that you are wanting to give them the opportunity to demonstrate and talk about the steps that they took. Finally, kind of this idea of perceived aptitude. And one of the things that I kind of want to go back to is for years and years and years, there's a fun little activity called the Marshmallow Challenge. Some of you may have heard of it. This is a simple kind of team building activity that's used often in industries and in kind of a business setting where teams have to take some spaghetti and some tape and some string and build the largest structure they can. And one of the things that they found when they did this with kind of again and again and again is that the teams that had really high pressure to do well, so for example, by saying like the team who wins gets $100,000, the result of that was that every single team failed. Every single tower that the teams built failed. They all broke because everyone was trying to do something outside of their capability, right? So the equation here that I'm pointing out is that a low skill set combined with a high pressure will result in disaster 99% of the time, right? So I think both sides here are going to be really important, right? And especially if we think about, well, who has a low perceived aptitude for writing skills? I would identify our second language students as one population that we need to be very, very, very aware of. And note that I'm not saying that they actually have a low skill set, because that's not what matters. What matters is whether they think they have a low skill set, or you're right. So it's a perception issue, right? Second language writers are going to be a demographic that we're going to really want to pay attention to, as will writers who come from places where their native dialect is significantly different than the academic dialect, right? So I'm speaking here in part of African-American vernacular English. I'm speaking in part here of many Latino and Latina communities, where the dialect spoken at home is significantly different than the dialect being taught in schools in some pretty fundamental sorts of ways, right? So when you combine that with a high pressure situation, for example, a paper worth a quarter of their grade, a third of their grade, a half of their grade, that's where we're running into trouble. And that's where my students observed that students more often turn to these tools in ways that were not productive. I tell the story, or include the story here. My first assignment for my students is a narrative, real low key. I tell them to use whatever dialect they're comfortable with. And in this case, it was, tell me, I want you to talk about your research process for something that you did recently, just to get them thinking about research, right? And I had one student who completely generated theirs using ChatGPT because they were absolutely convinced that if I saw their natural writing, I would be inclined to fail them for the entire semester because it was, quote unquote, it was so bad, right? Which is tragic and just heartbreaking on so many levels, right? But I don't think it's that rare, right? I don't think it's that rare for students to have this kind of ingrained sense of inferiority for a whole complex set of reasons, right? But it's something that I think it's important for us to be aware of. So one thing that we can do, I think, is encourage students to use resources like the Writing Center, and there are many others, right, to help increase their perception of their own skill sets. The other, and this may be a little bit more controversial, is not everything has to be written in the academic dialect, right? Certainly, there are certain projects in which you are purposely creating capstones or other kinds of publication, kind of publication style artifacts where attention to very specific dialects and very specific conventions are going to be important. But there are other forms of writing in which those things are probably going to be less important, right? In-class writing, email, reflections, journals, all of those kinds of things. If we can encourage our students to use the dialect that they are comfortable with and familiar with, and really focus more on the content that they're trying to discuss rather than the conventions of the academic prestige dialect, that helps to lower that pressure, right? That helps to lower that perceived pressure and helps the students become more comfortable in their writing and more free and more open to do, to show you their work instead of showing you AI's work, right? Or a plagiarized piece of work. So to kind of sum all of this up, if I have a set of recommendations, it is these. Number one, I think faculty can personalize writing prompts to students' lives and experiences. I think this is regardless of the course you're teaching and what discipline you're in. I think we can all work to help make our writing prompts and our educational experiences more personal and more relevant to the students' own lives and experiences. Number two, I think we need to teach and model the use of these tools in class. I don't think that we can just blow it off. I don't think banning it is going to be any more effective than when we tried to ban Wikipedia in the early aughts, right? People kept doing it anyway, and we just got to get madder and madder about it, but it did not change behavior in any way, shape, or form, right? So I do think we need to teach and model the use of these tools in specific ways and to really focus on the ways that are positive, right? So if we kind of think back at the slide in which we kind of lay out the different steps of the writing process, pick one, right? Pick one of those steps or aspects and take a half a class or a third of a class and kind of run the students through how can we use these tools in productive sorts of ways. Third, provide students a space to demonstrate their use of these tools. I can tell you in the first year composition program, we are now at a point where the paper the student is writing is worth 50% of their grade, and the reflection on that paper is worth the other 50% of that grade. Giving them a space to talk about what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it and the decisions that they made along the way, in our experience, has been much more helpful than punishing slips in the artifact and then trying to somehow reverse engineer what caused those things, right? So I want to encourage people, and I know it's a change in pedagogy, I want to encourage people to at least consider having some sort of a reflective or accompanying document where students can discuss their process and discuss the ways in which they used a variety of tools, both for their sake and for your sake, to help assist in the entire educational process. Finally, recognizing that the more underprepared a student feels, the more likely they are to abuse these tools. So number one, help them feel more confident by recommending specific support services, whether that's tutoring, the writing center, other class members, whatever, right? Number two, individual student conferences go a long way to humanizing the process. We had 3 individual student conferences through the semester. I know that becomes problematic for very, very large classes, but I also think it's an irreplaceable element of the educational experience, and that it is worth the investment. I think it is absolutely worth the time investment. And finally, help the students feel less pressured by relaxing applications of standards where they're not completely necessary, and by having realistic standards in the first place. One of the things that I've been talking to with faculty is kind of pointing out that when everyone publishes things, they have things called editors to help people get their written work into final form, into final polished version. I think it is entirely reasonable to expect that the work that students producing will likewise not be perfect on the first draft or even the second draft, and that often, if you want to get to that kind of publishable level quality, it requires an editor. It requires a professional in the field to help people through those processes, right? So I think having realistic standards in the first place and applying those standards carefully will go a long way to help making our students feel more comfortable. And that, dear friends, is the end of the presentation.
I did have a question
Yeah.
in the chat about how you have students show their work with AI. So do you have them like record it or?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that actually really impressed me about the Grammarly for Education product is that there is a piece of that tool that will literally record every prompt that a student puts into that space and collates that entire process into essentially an exportable document that they can include in something like a reflection, right? Certainly, people are capable of creating those records on their own. So yeah, I have them literally create a transcript. I have them write down, here's the prompt that I used, here's the answer that I got, here's what I did to that answer, here's how I manipulated that information. So I do have them literally create a transcript of, here are all of the interactions that I had with this tool when I was generating this product.
Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, so as a follow-up to that, like in terms of incorporating that into grading, like does it make the grading process longer than it is, or is it about the same?
Oh yeah, no, it makes it longer for sure. Because now you have to read 2 documents instead of 1 document. But it also changes it because in some ways I'm less concerned about little mistakes in the product and more concerned about their explanation of what they were trying to do in their reflection, right? So it changes the ratio in a lot of ways. And I will say, from my perspective, one of the most important things is we give our students separate rubrics. One rubric is for the artifact that delineates, here are the skill sets that I need to see demonstrated in this artifact. And then we have a separate one for the reflection that very clearly lays out, here are the things that I need you to talk about in your reflection, including how did you come up with the topic? Who did you work with? How did that go? What kind of tools did you use? How did you use them, right? So we have separate rubrics for each one of those. So does it increase the time and the complexity of the grading process? Yes, it does. I think it's worth it, but it's certainly something that faculty have to take into account when they're doing this. I'll also say there's a curve to it, right? So the first time that you try to incorporate and shift from an object-only assessment to a process-oriented assessment, which is effectively what we're talking about, it'll take a while because you're trying to kind of renegotiate your equations, effectively speaking. Once you've done it a couple semesters, it actually goes pretty quickly. So yes, I spend more time, but like 5 to 10% more time, not double, not triple.
All right, what other questions do we have?
I want to reply to something that I'm seeing in chat, which is about Grammarly and AI. So let me distinguish between two very, very different things. Grammarly, the free version of Grammarly, which does proofreading, is basically akin to the Microsoft Word version of the little blue squiggly lines that does proofreading, right? That sort of thing. That is not the kind of AI that we are talking about today. That is arguably AI insofar as it has to use a linguistic database to find out what you are probably trying to say. But it is not generative AI in the ways that we are talking about. So I do want to kind of distinguish. There are two very, very different things that happen in Grammarly. One of them is proofreading, and that does not use the GPT model that we have been talking about. But the commercial versions of Grammarly, like the one that we tested, Grammarly for Education, also has a generative AI feature within it. And kind of for whatever this is worth, there's an administrative control that the teacher has. And as a teacher, you can turn that off. You can turn that feature off for your entire class. I'm not recommending that your class uses that product in any way, shape, or form. I'm just, yeah, I'm not trying to, this is not a commercial for Grammarly. I don't hate it. I'm not suggesting you use it. I'm just kind of reporting what we found when we used it. And here I just kind of want to distinguish the difference between the proofreading tools and the AI tools are a very clear distinction within the Grammarly ecosystem. Mariana's asking, have you published your AI research? Where can you reread it? Citations, please. This is the 7th of these presentations I have done in the last 12 months, give or take. I'm not, I don't do the whole publication thing all that often. I tend to do kind of grassroots, let's do some things and see what happens and then talk about it and report it to my community. I'm happy to share information with anyone who does want to publish stuff. I'm super happy to be a collaborator on that. I don't really have any interest in doing it myself, though. So if you want to talk more about it, I'm happy to share information. I'm happy to share citations. I'm super happy to point you to really clever people already doing this kind of work. David Gunkel, others within both the computer science department and the communications department who are absolutely wonderful and fantastic, who will know much more than I about that whole side of things. I am more on the usability side of things, and let's see what actually kind of a street view. Let's see what actually works. Yeah, you absolutely may email me. My email is going to be in chat momentarily.
And I will send a follow-up email after this with links to a bunch of different resources too on AI, along with the recording for this presentation. So you'll have that as well, including some books by David Gunkel, which we have in our library. Great. Any other questions or comments? We had some great comments in the chat here about how helpful it is that you broke down the tools and the steps of writing, all of that, which is great. All right. Well, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to Eric, or you can reach out via me too. I can, if you lose his email address, you can reach out to me, respond to the follow-up email that I'll be sending later today. And I'd be happy to forward that and put you in touch with Eric again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Eric.